Ahmed bin Muhammad, better known as Tippu Tip, was one of the most prolific slave traders in history. His date of birth is estimated to be around 1837. He was born in the island of Zanzibar off the coast of Tanzania in East Africa. Tippu Tip's mother, Bint Habib bin Bushir, was a Muscat Arab from the ruling class. His father and paternal grandfather were coastal Arabs from the Swahili coast and were active participants in slave trading expedition to the interior of Africa. In his autobiography, Maisha, Tippu Tip explains how he got his nickname from the tip-tip sound that his guns made during the expeditions in the interior of Africa. Some sources say that the nickname is from the Swahili word finder of wealth, but I cannot confirm whether this is accurate. Others say he got the nickname because he constantly blinked while he was talking. This is something Tippu Tip was very conscious of, and he did not like this version of interpretation of his name. When Tippu Tip was born, his father was 500 miles away in Tabora, his major inland port where he had concubines and an African wife. He was over a year old by the time he met his father when he returned to Zanzibar to trade his goods. As a child, he was known as Hamad, and he spent his time receiving education from his mother and other tutors. This would later serve him well in adulthood. Aside from this, he had the opportunity to gain business knowledge and experience from his father. At a relatively young age, he got an opportunity to go on an expedition into Central Africa with a team of 100 men. They went in search of slaves and ivory for the already booming market at the Zanzibar coast. They did so by attacking villages. Those who survived were rounded up and sent to the coast. I always wondered why Tippu Tip was okay enslaving people with the same skin color as his. One of the European explorers who interacted with him wrote in his memoir that Tippu Tip was always sensitive when this subject came up. Apparently, he considered himself a pure Arab despite his black features. Some sources state that there was always an air of excitement in Zanzibar every time a trader came back with a good stock of ivory and slaves. And for this occasion, Tippu Tip's father Muhammad always wore his best silver dagger and gold embroidered waistcoat over the white langi. By the time he arrived, the market was usually already crowded. Dhow captains, local buyers, and idle spectators examined the goods as they waited for the sale to start. Muhammad's personal slaves were the ones leading the new slaves into the cages in which they would be sold. Muhammad was a wholesaler, and so he sold slaves in lots, not individually. Each cage was about 20 feet square and was capable of holding up to 150 slaves. On one occasion, he brought 600 men, women, and children. He walked around them deciding how many of each would make a cage. As a rule, a cage contained a mixed group of varying ages, physical condition, health, and strength. Muhammad was careful in his choices because too many or too few of one kind would mean the difference between a large and a small profit. He never separated the women from the infants, but he separated husbands from wives as buyers found them troublesome together and didn't pay as much for couples. When Tippu Tip was 6 years old, he was sent to a teacher of the Quran to learn how to read and write. He also helped in his mother's plantation, but he found it very dull. His greatest wish was to accompany his father in his trading caravans. When he was 12, Tippu Tip and his brother joined his uncle for their first ever trading expedition on the mainland. Slavery had been declared illegal in Britain in 1807. Zanzibar was not a British colony but was under British influence when Said the Sultan invited the British to appoint a consul there. This invitation brought a number of advantages since the Sultan had many enemies. It also had many disadvantages for all those involved in the slave trade. At a young age, Tippu Tip did not understand the political significance of the British presence, but he immediately accepted the need for secrecy. His uncle did not transport slaves since his dhows were fitted out for trade, but sometimes he did hide a few slaves under the sacks of cattle to do a friend a favor. Tippu Tip learnt very fast, both in Zanzibar and on the mainland at Kilwa and Bagamoyo. His father's friends allowed him to visit the customs house, the slave dhows, and the barracoons where slaves were stored waiting to be loaded on the dhows. The method of stowing was pretty much the same in that region. Temporary platforms of of bamboo were built, leaving a narrow path in the middle. The slaves were then stowed away in bulk. The first on the floor of the boat, 2 adults side by side with a boy or a girl resting between or on them until the tier was complete. Over them, the first platform was laid an inch or 2 above their bodies, where a second tier was stored, and so on until the boat was filled. Depending on the weather or interference by the British cruisers, the dhows took about 2 to 3 days to cross from mainland ports to Zanzibar. During this period, the slaves were given the minimum of food and water, and if for some reason the passage took longer than expected, they would quietly die and were thrown overboard when the owners of the dhows came to unload. Between the time of unloading and selling on the market, if a slave looked like he might not survive the interim period, he was thrown overboard to avoid paying the customs duty. This, however, was not the only instance of this inhumane act. When a British cruiser was in pursuit of a dhow that was carrying slaves, the captains of the dhows would order the slaves to be thrown overboard. As a young boy, Tippu Tip had often seen bloated corpses, either washed ashore or still floating on the ocean. Sometimes he would come across a slave still clinging to a piece of wood from the wreckage, starved and terrified but still alive. They would pull them aboard but later sold them in the market. Tippu Tip and his brother would often lean over the sides of the dhow and prod the bodies with their harpoons to check whether they were dead or not. Death was a very common occurrence to the young Tippu Tip, especially the death of slaves. The beaches of Zanzibar were often strewn with corpses, either from the dhows or from the recurring smallpox and cholera epidemics. The worst epidemics were in 1858 and 1869, when the island's population was nearly wiped out. 50,000 people died. By the time the first cholera epidemic struck, Tippu Tip had already left the island. When he was about 15 years old, his father had come back to Zanzibar, as he did every few years. He came to see his bankers and to make arrangements for fresh supplies to be sent to Tabora. He also wanted to confirm that the Banyan was not swindling him on the consignments of ivory and slaves sent to him. On this occasion, Muhammad finally agreed for his son to join him in Tabora. Also, this time round, his father came with his African wife, Karunde. The young Tippu Tip was very impressed by Karunde, not because she was African, but because she was the daughter of the great chief Fundi Kira, the most powerful chief of Unyamwezi, the region surrounding Tabora. To be married to a great chief's daughter meant that Muhammad was regarded as a chief himself. Chief Fundi Kira owned enormous stores of ivory, 2,000 head of cattle, and according to Tippu Tip, an unlimited number of slaves. Tippu Tip was often heard bragging that his father was well respected there, and whatever he wanted in and around Tabora, he got. He claimed his father had many followers and as much property as the chiefs of Uganda. Bint Habib bin Bushir, Tippu Tip's mother, was not enthusiastic about Karunde, but as was custom, she accepted the African wife into her home without any fuss. She felt her position was safe since she was a pure Omani Arab. As much as Karunde was a chief's daughter, she was still African. Later on, Tippu Tip established his base at Lake Tanganyika on the modern-day border between Tanzania, Zambia, Burundi, and the DR Congo. Because he had soldiers and gunpowder, it did not take him long to gain control of trade around the lake. As to how Tippu Tip managed to acquire the kingdom of Utetera in Central Africa, it is said that he had taken the trouble of finding out everything about Chief Kasongo Rushie of the Watetera. One of Tippu Tip's concubines was from Utetera. He had learnt many things since the day she was brought to him. Apart from the fact that Utetera had a very large population of elephants, Tippu Tip was made aware of the fact that many years ago, 2 of Chief Kasongo's sisters had been sold into slavery and no one heard from them again. When Tippu Tip encountered messengers from Utetera, he told them that one of the princesses had been sold to his own grandfather in Zanzibar, and she had become his favorite concubine. From this happy union, Tippu Tip's mother was born. His color and features helped him sell this story. Also, a few words of the Utetera language, which he had learnt from his concubine, went a long way to convince the envoys of the authenticity of this fantastic story. Tippu Tip and the messengers enjoyed a large platter of rice and mutton set out in front of his tent as he told them about his grandmother, the enslaved princess. Tippu Tip claimed that his grandmother always told him about the beauty and wealth of Utetera, and although she was treated like an Arab wife, she longed to see her country again. Just before she died, Tippu Tip claimed that his grandmother made him promise that one day he would go to Utetera and find her brother, Chief Kasongo. When the news reached the chief, he fell for this story and sent out envoys to lead Tippu Tip and his enormous caravan into the heart of Utetera. Uncle Kasongo knew this is one nephew he had better acknowledge. Besides, Tippu Tip's fighting force and reputation would make sure that no one bothers Kasongo again. To show pleasure at the prospect of meeting Tippu Tip, the chief sent 300 goats and 20 large elephant tusks. Accompanied by the envoys and a member of Kasongo's royal clan, they traveled for days studying the country as they crossed, Tippu Tip congratulating himself on his choice of uncles. Utetera would suit him very well for a couple of years. When they arrived, Chief Kasongo had prepared a great reception for them. Thousands of people came to meet them when they approached the chief's village. Banana leaf arches were erected all along the road leading to the village. Women brought baskets of fruits and vegetables. A herd of goats was led into the compound for their use. Kasongo's chief advisor, a very old man, almost completely covered in monkey skins, welcomed them into the village and explained that his master will visit them after they have eaten and refreshed themselves. Chief Kasongo did not let them wait too long. Drumming and blowing of horns announced his arrival. Tippu Tip and his men were ready to receive him in their best white langi, gold-embroidered coats and ceremonial headdress. Greetings were exchanged, and then the old chief and Tippu Tip alone entered the baraza and discussed the future of Utetera. When they finally emerged from the discussions, they were both smiling and the people stamped and screamed with joy. The chief informed his people that the next day they would have a baraza and they will get to hear his proposal. What the chief proposed was everything Tippu Tip was hoping for. The chief told his people that he was getting old and tired and he could no longer fight his enemies alone. He said to his people, "Now a man, not a stranger, but the grandson of my sister, has come from very far away to give me the power of my youth and strength. Obey him. As I am chief, he is chief with me. For protecting us against our enemies, he will only ask for the teeth of the elephant. Give them to him and all that he requires." And just like that, Tippu Tip had acquired a kingdom for himself. He later renamed it as the Sultanate of Utetera. Fortunately for him, the chief had no interest in the ivory trade. He believed the elephant was the chief of the animals, the same way that the sun was the chief of the skies. Therefore, he never looked at the sun. Neither did he touch elephant tusks. Life in Kasongo settled down into a simple routine of peaceful trading and punitive expeditions against offending neighbors. Tippu Tip was fair with his new subjects, but pitiless against offenders, and his punitive parties spread terror around the countryside. Unfortunately, on one of those punitive expeditions, 60 men led by Tippu Tip's real uncle, Bushiri, were ambushed, and every single member of the party was killed and eaten on the spot. When the news of the death of his uncle reached him at the capital, Tippu Tip was furious and very sad. Uncle Bushiri was closer to him than his own father. In retaliation, he led his own forces and allowed them to butcher and eat the enemy until the smell of flesh made him sick. Chief Kasongo had gone with him and brought his army, and for days they hunted, looted, burnt, and killed. Most of the communities living in that region engaged in cannibalism. They also filed their teeth to points as a mark of beauty. Despite their eating habits, the Watetera made good, loyal subjects. The neighboring communities, after being defeated in a series of battles, contributed their quota of ivory, goats, and slaves. Years later, during the scramble and partition of Africa, Tippu Tip struck an agreement with King Leopold II of Belgium, and they arrived at a mutual beneficial agreement. Since rubber was the new popular commodity, both Leopold and Tippu Tip had the plantations, but the king, however, did not have labor. And so Tippu Tip went on a massive manhunt across Central Africa, plundering neighboring villages to collect slaves for himself and the king. It is estimated that Tippu Tip alone had over 6,000 slaves working in rubber plantations. The cruelty and mass murder that occurred in these plantations has been documented by historians in detail. A mariner known as Alfred Swan, who had been tasked with the job of dismantling a boat, carrying it to Lake Tanganyika and rebuilding it so that it can be used for missionary work, explained in his journal what he encountered in the region. On one occasion, he came across Tippu Tip's slaves heading back to Zanzibar carrying ivory. Many of the people we saw were chained by the neck. Others had their necks in forked poles about 6 feet long, which was supported by the people preceding them. The women carried babies on their backs, in addition to the large piece of ivory on their heads. They looked at us with suspicion and fear, having been told that white men desire to release slaves in order to eat their flesh like the Upper Congo cannibals. It is difficult to adequately describe the terrible state of their bodies. In many instances, not only scarred but whipped by Chico, a long, fierce-looking leather whip. Their feet and shoulders were a mass of sores, made more painful by the massive swarm of flies following the foul smell of the open oozing wounds and blood. They presented a moving picture of utter misery, and one could not help wondering how any of them had survived the long trek from the Upper Congo, at least 1,000 miles away. The headmen in charge were most polite to us as they passed our camp. Addressing one, I pointed out that many of the slaves were unfit to carry loads. To this, he replied while smiling, "They have no choice. They must go or die." Historians estimate that 3 out of every 4 slaves died during these horrific treks across Africa. The slaves were needed for the local plantations as well as for export. Ivory was also important because without slave porters, it could never have reached the Zanzibar market. Tippu Tip's journey into the African interior began in the late 1850s. By the 1870s, he ruled over such a big area, confirming or replacing local chiefs with loyal regents. His primary interest was, however, commercial. He monopolized elephant hunting, built roads, and developed plantation around major Arab settlements, including Kasongo in the Upper Congo River, where he settled in 1875. In 1876 to 77, Tippu Tip accompanied the British explorer Henry Morton Stanley down the Congo River and later sent expeditions further extending his reach into the region. By the early 1880s, he aligned himself with Sultan Bargash of Zanzibar to expand Arab influence in the Congo. In opposition to King Leopold II International Association of the Congo. In 1883, Tippu Tip returned to Stanley Falls with the aim of taking control of the Congo Basin for Zanzibar. He stayed in the region until 1886, amassing more ivory before returning to Zanzibar. By this time, European nations had recognized Leopold's claim to the Congo, and Tippu Tip realized that an alliance with the International Association was unavoidable. In 1887, Henry Morton Stanley, secretly working to establish the Congo Free State, proposed that Tippu Tip be made the governor of the Stanley Falls district, a position endorsed by both King Leopold and the Sultan of Zanzibar. However, Tippu Tip's tenure was short-lived. Tasked with controlling Arab traders in the region, he lacked the weapons necessary to maintain power, and many Arabs resented his cooperation with the Europeans. By 1890, Europeans began amassing all sides of his territory. He abandoned his post and returned to Zanzibar. The Congo-Arab War broke out after Tippu Tip had already returned to Zanzibar. Both sides fought with armies recruited from indigenous communities, but with Arab or European commanders. The authority of King Leopold was still very weak in the eastern part of the Congo. The power was mostly held by the Arab or Swahili strongmen. Among these were Tippu Tip's son, Sefu bin Hamad, and another trader known as Rumaliza. In 1892, Sefu attacked Belgian ivory traders since he viewed them as a threat to the Swahili Arab monopoly. The Free State government sent a force under Commander Francis Danis. Danis had an early success because a chief named Ngongo Lutete changed sides from Sefu's to his. The Belgian army was also better armed and organized. They defeated their opponents in many battles until the death of Sefu on 20th October 1893. Rumaliza was forced to flee to German territory in 1895. Back in Zanzibar, Tippu Tip used his immense wealth to establish clove plantations with 10,000 slaves. In his autobiography, he claims he was only an ivory trader. Many sources, however, point to the active participation in the East African slave trade. Tippu Tip led several expeditions to the interior of Africa and collaborated with a number of European explorers such as Dr. Livingstone, Stanley, Wisman, and Cameron. While on these expeditions, he continued to collect slaves and ivory. Tippu Tip passed away on the 13th of June 1905 after contracting malaria. He died in his 3-story home in Stone Town, the main town on the island of Zanzibar. The infamous slave market in Zanzibar was closed down by the British in 1896, and a cathedral was built in its place. The main altar at the cathedral is placed at the exact location of the slave market whipping post.